Good evening and welcome to the Wheeler Centre's inaugural F-Word address. My name is Emily Sexton and I'm the Head of Programming. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, to those who've passed, those who are present, and those who may be with us tonight, alongside a very warm welcome to all the Indigenous people who are here at the lovely Northcote Town Hall. Tonight is the first in what we hope will be many years of the F-Word address. It's a direct and honest appraisal of the year that was, what in the last 12 months has challenged our feminism and what has emboldened it. 2016 is a real humdinger. Today, of all days, it feels that glass ceilings have been reassembled and fortified. Being the best person for the job, ready to contribute and make a difference to your community, and then the goalposts move and suddenly criteria and expectations are created which exclude you. So, in a way that I take no particular programming pleasure from, tonight is a very timely moment to hear from a vitally important female leader in the Australian sporting and journalism communities. Caroline Wilson started her career in the early 1980s, and she has won many significant firsts, including the first female recipient of the AFL Gold Media Award. In recent years, she's won praise and gained some powerful enemies for her fearless opinion writing on the Essendon supplement scandal. And throughout her long career at The Age, she's won a Walkley Award, a Graham Perkin Award, and a Melbourne Press Club Quill Award. And if there was an award for staring down reactionary nonsense, she definitely would have won that too. Footy, for all of us, is a marker of so much more in sport than footy is about so much more than sport in Melbourne. It's about family, it's about culture, and it's become about social progress as well. To reflect on the overlap between the two, please join me in welcoming Caroline Wilson to deliver the inaugural F-Word address.
Thank you. Oh, it's great applause. Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate you inviting me here tonight. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Amita. I must say, when I was asked to deliver the inaugural F-Word address, I had a nasty feeling that the F-Word didn't stand for football. I did immediately, initially anyway, mentally resist. I'm far more comfortable telling other people's stories than I am my own, and I really don't believe that there is a better sport, subject or institution ahead of AFL football that provides such a rich backdrop for those stories. So in addressing the F-Word, and I have always been a feminist, but I honestly don't believe it was until the last few years that I saw it as in any way having parallels with my job. I think it'll be helpful if I can tell you a little bit about myself and my history and about a couple of incidents you may or may not remember from recent years involving me and not my work. An AFL commissioner actually said to me over dinner one night recently when I was pontificating about some bugbear or another, he interrupted me mid-sentence and said, he in fact looked at me baffled and said, "You realise, don't you, that you have the best job in the world?" Well, in fact, it's not the best job in the world, but I do believe it's up there. I wasn't the first to cover football full-time as a woman. One of my closest friends, Graham Perkin, was that person. She'd spent a year pioneering as a young footy writer with The Age, and she'd simply said to me, "It's a great gig, you should have a go at it." I first started writing about football 35 years ago when I was 21. I was a fairly average cadet coming to the end of my cadetship, in fact, at the old Melbourne Herald newspaper, a place where sports writers were shut away in a separate room, a room where there always seemed to be a lot more laughter and a lot of shouting, but a lot of fun. My first sports editor, the very recently retired Ron Reid, told me that I was coming in as an experiment, a woman in the all-male sports department, and that I would cover every sport but boxing, which I can assure you was not a great stretch for me. 3.5 decades later, my sports editor is a woman, Chloe Salto, and I work alongside some of the game's most respected sports writers who are also women in Emma Quayle and Samantha Lane, Linda Pearce, who's just covered another Wimbledon this year, with a couple of good up-and-comers in Claire Siracusa, and also Larissa Nicholson, who had a real crack today at the AFL over its women's pay dispute with the new AFL Women's. Back then, I was pushed by Ron out of the office every week, midweek, weekend, whatever, to literally go and find a story on the outskirts of town, whether it be a softball game at Gels Park, a country race meeting, a hang-gliding human interest story at Port Punker, or a women's cricket game in Bendigo. As summer became autumn, I began looking to the VFL, the old VFL, for those human interest stories. If only media employers today, just as an aside, could indulge young reporters now the way they did with me back then. But one thing hasn't changed. Football was a tough gig and it was largely embracing, and I believe it still is, one of the most embracing football code in the world. Just as the game accommodates more shapes and sizes and colours than any other code, it largely embraced me, its first full-time footy journo, albeit with the strange odd moment. Turning up to work one Monday after covering my first practice game, and I have told this story before, and I'm sorry if people have heard me, but it was a Collingwood-Carlton game at Princes Park. And when I got to work, that was on the Saturday, I filed the story, I got to work on the Monday, and the all-male sports subs desk looked at me with a newfound respect. In fact, they looked at me very strangely. They simply couldn't believe that a woman could go to a footy game and report on it quite accurately. I've always had that slight feeling that I've been conning people ever since, because of course most people here know that women can of course describe football very accurately and maybe have a different look at it and maybe a better look at it at times. From that game on, I was allowed to cover it on a weekly basis. Of course, when I had to go to the functions before the games, I had to sit with the women, the wives of the players and the officials, which is where, as anyone who knows the game will tell you, the stories are. Another plus. I'm the daughter of a former Richmond president, Ian Wilson, and he was there for 12 years, and growing up and having, a good part of my life, pretty much from the age of 10, watching and listening to women around the Richmond Football Club, I was already well aware that women had a very big say in what went on the footy field. One day in that first pre-season, I sat pre-game with the wife of one of the game's biggest names, greatest legends, whose analysis of the game, I must say, was flawless. At one point, though, she looked at me, and her analysis of her club's current plight was flawless as well, and her husband's role in all of that. But at one point, she looked at me and said, "I really don't think women should be writing about football, though." And I said, "What are you talking about? You've just, given a fantastic analysis of what's going on at your footy club." She said, "Oh, but I'd never do it at home. He doesn't let me talk about football at home." I was accused of giving votes to good-looking players only because they had nice beards, threatened with being exposed to unfathomable parts of a male anatomy due to, he was a wounded full-back, by the way, and that was by way of the coach explaining to me why another player had a big swollen face and a bruised, swollen black eye, and we'd photographed it for the front page of the paper. And I was told to look at this bloke's big black balls, basically, to understand why the other guy had a black eye. I hate to think of the charges that would happen, workplace charges that would happen now. I was marched out of changing rooms by two club presidents, one who apologised later by saying he thought I was a groupie, and banned from the changing rooms by a third club president who was my father. No kidding, I was taken to the kitchen when I arrived at my first football writers' dinner and handed an apron because they thought I must have been one of the waitresses. When I overstepped the mark, I was yelled at by coaches and club bosses, and that was fine. There was no social media, no club websites, no mobile phones, and no media managers. It was actually a fantastic time to cover the game. So many great stories, I loved every minute of it. There have been some terrifying and terrible moments since then, but there have been some great ones, just to digress, and some of the things I've been so lucky to do. Walking the final 2 days, watching Greg Norman shake the monkey off his back at Turnberry back in the mid-80s over a wild weekend, catching the train from Paddington to Liverpool in the UK after that city's fans had rioted and caused the burning down of Belgium's Heysel Stadium, and trying as a 24-year-old to get inside the heads of those Liverpool so-called hooligans. sitting with the bewildered Becker parents after their 17-year-old son Boris had come from obscurity to serve his way to victory at Wimbledon, and finally being taken into the fold by a group of world-weary, grumpy Fleet Street, inspiring though, Fleet Street sports journalists over 2 glorious summers I will always refer to as Brigadoon. Sitting with Ron Barassi and Simon Madden in Ireland one night arguing about Catholicism, only to be called by the front desk by my Chief of Staff to tell me that Australia's most wanted man, Robert Trimboli, had just been arrested across the road. And later on, sometimes you're just in the right place. And later on, trying to retrace the final days and sum up the sad endings of men in the game, from Darren Mullane or to Vin Knight, who of course was in the racing industry, and to Alan Schwab, examining the fascinating but flawed Melbourne Commonwealth Olympic Games bid, following Cathy Freeman's soap operatic but ultimately glorious journey to Olympic gold, and as age chief footy writer over the last 18, 19 years, covering epic football stories and breaking some of them, like the Carlton salary cap scandal, Malcolm Blight's sacking from St Kilda, the rise of Andrew Demetriou, the expose of the Melbourne tanking affair, the Wayne Carey scandal, and the AFL's bold decision to expand to 18 teams. To this day, when criticism or harsh debate comes my way, I generally see it as part of the job. Why be a senior journalist or, in fact, try and communicate with people in a different way if you can't take people where they can't normally go, off the playing field and into the dressing rooms, to profess strong and occasionally harsh opinions about something you're passionate about, or to try and dispel some of football's many myths, to write stories they don't want you to write, to quote an old editor of mine, John Fitzgerald. And so you have to expect at times when stuff comes back at you. Not so much now, and more of this in a moment, but the footy show, for all its good stuff in the early days, tended to hit back at some of those stronger columns and the wider issue of female involvement in the game stronger than others, with some occasionally vile, even back in the late 90s and early 2000s, with some occasionally vile sexist attacks upon me, and some strange ones. I still remember a young Luke Darcy asking on that show, do you think it's because she's a woman that she feels the need to profess stronger opinions than anyone else? But generally, I think those attitudes are on the way out, even though some are dragging their feet. I will mention briefly, as an early career highlight, a man who I believe is an unsung hero, the former Premier John Cain, who decided in the second year of, in an early year of being Premier of Victoria, that the MCG and in fact the Flemington racecourse was Crown land, and why on earth were women banned from the members at Flemington and the long room at the MCG. Ever since 1982, when my mother and my sister and I, all massive footy fans, were able to jump the queue and become members of the MCG, I saw that as a major turning point for women who love football. Gillan McLachlan, strong-armed, I suspect, into being a male champion of change, now does seem committed to being that champion, although I'm disappointed that, and I've written about this actually in Tomorrow's Age, I'm disappointed that the AFL hasn't fronted its AFL Women's League with a woman. I just don't understand how they could miss such a major, major opportunity for change and to make such a great symbolic statement. Finally, the AFL executive, though, does not consist primarily of white, male, old private schoolboys. Finally, women are not leaving the head office of the game in worryingly disproportionate numbers, disenchanted. I firmly believe that if the next AFL chairman is not a woman, then I think Mike Fitzpatrick will have let the side down, and I think he'll believe that as well. The Commission has dragged its feet at times, the AFL Commission, I should say, but did finally, clumsily, introduce its first woman board member back at the start of this millennium, Sam Mostyn, as an add-on because no male would stand down to let her in. In her own way, Sam was, and still is, even though she's no longer on the Commission, a disruptor before that word became a corporate noun. Had she and Linda Dessau and Emma mentioned Essendon not been sitting on the AFL board when the Essendon penalties were being delivered, I suspect those penalties would have been further diluted. Sometimes it's a great asset not being a member of the boys' club. That experimental drug program football's worst story, in my experience, and I think in the history of the game, was not without its moments of personal and professional threats and pushback. But I remain in debt to those mothers and partners and other family members and anonymous player representatives who feared for the worst and anonymously broke the party line to expose and help me and other journos at the age with key elements of that terrible time. How on earth coaches and other footy staff were paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, or doctors who were regarded as the best in their field and trusted by young men, still failed to stop this program, still makes me very angry. Sam Mostyn was also the first commissioner to push the game early in this millennium, the women's game I should say, and recognise that to empower and expand its then fragmented women's competitions would help make our game an even greater game. And now, of course, women's footy is the fastest growing area of the game in Australia. The birth of the National League has had many mothers and fathers, like all successful ventures, and I do think Gillan McLaughlin deserves credit for fast-tracking it. But I think also Susan Alberti, the Western Bulldogs director, is another one. She's been a champion in so many games, but she stepped in many years ago to sponsor the Victorian Women's League way before it became sexy and a serious magnet for new AFL sponsors. And I think she too has been a serious disruptor. And I think football now will be, to the threat of soccer and rugby, now that it's got women involved. However, anyone ever said that women serve no purpose on AFL boards still baffles me. Someone asked me a few months ago what advice I would give to this new breed of national women footballers coming into the game. And I might add that I never really saw this coming in the numbers that it has come. I do think it's one of the most exciting stories in Australian sport, in fact, for many years. But they pose challenges. Those clubs who've successfully bid to field foundation national teams say they're well equipped to handle the women and the recruiting challenges, the issues of male and female dressing rooms, and the fight for recognition and the diversity of relationships that I think are going to separate the women from the men. So my advice would be you are a blank piece of paper. No historic or cultural impediment stands in front of you. Embrace it. Just as the AFL commercial team has gone back to scratch in designing their uniforms and sporting apparel for the women, I would say don't emulate the men in the way you present yourselves. At some point in the game's history, it became taboo for men to talk about their strengths, to give us insights into what makes them so good, so determined to subscribe publicly to Team First and Daylight Second. Journalists, and therefore supporters in my view, have been too rarely given insights into what makes our players and therefore our game so special. If you are not self-deprecating or to be brutal bland, then too often you're a traitor to the cause. That's why as a reporter I love covering Olympic Games and even tennis majors and golf majors, because you actually hear from those elite athletes what makes them tick. And I hope the women are better at doing that than the men have been over many, many years. Now, just very quickly on a couple of personal incidents. On the Monday night of the Queen's birthday weekend, when I was first told by a young male producer at Channel 9 about a conversation on Triple M that day involving Eddie Maguire and James Brayshaw and Danny Frawley, my initial reaction was the same as it has been many times before when that station or the footy show has launched one of their gang attacks. You feel a bit sick about it, wonder whether you deserved it, and ultimately pretend that you don't care. Although it must be said that I did think those days and those conversations had ended some years ago. Since I joined Channel 9 back in 2007, my colleagues for most of that time, Gary Lyon and Craig Hutchison, always hated being accused of bullying me, and they felt that I gave as good as I got, that they were unfairly attacked because I was a female and audiences simply couldn't handle a group of males and a female engaging in a robust debate. And in most cases, I think they had a point. But sometimes the rules of engagement in this very high-octane, obsessive, consuming and passionate world in which we work are broken. And I think those Triple M guys broke the boundaries. That was on the day of the Ice Bucket Challenge, I should say. It seemed over a few weeks during that period in June that everyone with a voice across the country actually spoke about it or had an opinion about it. And I think I just would like to make a few points. mainly on the positives that came out of it. One, that most of the older guys I work with didn't see it as an issue, certainly not on Channel 9, but the younger reporters, the 20-somethings, a young producer, Ed Bowman, and a program reporter, Mitch Cleary, were devastated by it, didn't like it, and thought we should have debated it on the show. They were shouted down by the older blokes. Two, the issue became a national story, largely due to a group of women in their 30s and 40s who call themselves the Outer Sanctum. They're riots, they're poets. I've said this before, mothers, cooks, and they work every week doing a podcast from a kitchen in Box Hill. They're the women who Sam Newman referred to as second-tier media. But in fact, they are the majority in football. Three, in 2008, when Sam Newman staple-gunned my headshot to a mannequin in underwear on the footy show, and the AFL then Chief Executive Andrew Demetriou slammed the stunt, called me the next morning to express his disgust, and then did it again at a media conference, not one footy journo reported his comments. 8 years later, when it happened, when the Triple M stuff happened, Gillan McLachlan spoke about it, and the AFL actually issued a media release and forced the people involved to apologise. Some of them took a bit longer than others. Some of them had a few goes at it, in fact. It was terribly embarrassing for me. It was very unpleasant for my family to hear that stuff replayed over and over again. But of course, I was going to cope with it. I still love football just as much as I always have. Life goes on. I work next door to those Triple M blokes every Saturday when I work on radio to do the pre-game, or I did for the season, and I'll continue to do so. But I just felt that if I didn't say something, that I would be letting down a lot of people who have been bullied over the years. And I really think that people in our media, whoever they are, should think more before they speak. And I think they needed to be held to account, even though there were still people who come up to me and say that I was a bit of a princess about the whole thing. Smart people who I respect, like Neil Mitchell on 3AW, and Lee Matthews, who I work with on 3AW, still hold the view that I give as good as I get. One retired champion used his own on-field analogy to that end, that he would never complain when he was whacked on the football field because he whacked people. Never complain, never explain. Well, I do think that Eddie Maguire should start thinking about a succession plan at Collingwood. That was the initial column that I wrote that upset him so much. And I certainly think for the first half of his presidency, James Brayshaw remained a divisive figure at North Melbourne and did not embrace key aspects of the job. And Danny Frawley's performance at the AFL Coaches Association had to be examined and come under serious question back in the day that he was doing that job. But I don't ever recall saying that Collingwood members should physically attack Eddie, or that James be attacked by the Kangaroos constituency, or Danny be held underwater by 18 AFL coaches, or even just Alistair Clarkson, even as a joke. One senior football person put it to me earlier this year. He used the analogy that there are men still working in the game who are very happy to have women in senior roles, but only to a certain extent and only to a certain limit. And I think that if, and I was asked to extrapolate a bit on this, whether this year has changed my opinion, I sort of know what he means. Certainly the attitudes towards me have probably changed the more senior I've become in the job. And he also said that they just don't like you to hold too many strong opinions, and they only want certain types of women. He likened the scenario to the supporters who love and who doesn't, Cyril Rioli and Eddie Betts, and therefore insists that they're not racist because they boo Adam Goodes. It was an interesting analogy. Not that I'm comparing myself to Adam Goodes. One more point about the sport of men. It's probably far-fetched and even sexist to invoke the Brexit scenario, as I have several times this year, but I do think there are many occasions whereby a woman tends to come in and clean up the mess made by a group of men. Sadly, not the case yesterday, Emma. But although we wait, the examples in footy are tantalising. The AFL welcomed its first woman club president, that was to the Richmond board, only after the board was hopelessly divided. St Kilda was still a financial and cultural mess, when a new regime took over at that footy club and immediately installed 3 women onto its executive. That was a first at the time for any AFL club. I've already spoken about the women commissioners and their role in choosing the Essendon penalties. When an AFL executive appointment went pear-shaped last year, another woman, who should have been an executive anyway, was immediately promoted. When the footy show was struggling badly in the face of the Gary Lyon, Billy Brownless scandal, guess who they brought in to fix it up? Another woman, and it's worked. And when a bruised Eddie Maguire took himself off Fox Footy mid-year from those Thursday night commentary programs and went overseas to escape the fracas of the Triple M scandal, who did they turn to replace him? Sarah Jones, who finally got her big break after being at that network for more than 15 years. And she rated accordingly. Women do see things differently. We think about the game differently. We write about it differently. And I think we have changed, diversified and improved the way it's covered. And we even love it differently. Now, there are people in this room who've heard me say this many times, but I think it's a good note to end. I fell in love with it as a child back in the 1960s. And back in the 1960s, there was a program on television on Channel 7 every Sunday night called Disneyland. And every Sunday night, and remember you could go to Frontierland and Adventureland and Fantasyland, and you'd wait to see what land you were going to go to that Sunday night. And every week my parents would come in and tell myself and my brother and sister that we were luckier than those American kids because we could go to Tigerland. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hope that was all right.
Thanks, that was great. Thank you, Caroline. That was fantastic.
Thank you, Emma.
So you've spoken incredibly honestly, and we're really appreciative of that. But I wondered, nastiness in the public eye and bullying, it's definitely not enjoyable. But when you think about all the challenges you faced as a mother, as a friend, as a sister, or I assume, does it actually rate all those incidents in terms of the challenging things that you've done in your life?
I think the attention obviously was very challenging because I'm an ambitious journalist and I want to break stories every day and write strong opinions, and it was an enormous distraction, and it was embarrassing being the centre of attention. It was embarrassing when people started to compare the conversation to domestic violence. I'm not saying that language is not something we should look at very closely, but I felt embarrassed that I felt bad that I was being talked about in any breath comparatively to victims of domestic violence. So much good came out of it, Emma. I mean, so many young women in the AFL industry across clubs got in touch with me about issues that they'd suffered in the workplace. And I think it shifted something for me because it's always considered a great compliment. I mean, the men I work with consider it a great compliment. Often I remember guys at clubs saying to me, "Oh no, but you've done a great job. Everyone really hates you." Again, I mean, that's a compliment in the industry I work in. So you're starting from a different parameter to most jobs. Apparently it's great to be hated by all the men because they're so resentful and
Well, you're pointing out things that other people haven't thought about yet. So
yes, and I mean, and when I'm beaten to a story, I hate that, but I don't think I hate the person who actually breaks the story. I certainly hate getting beaten, but I think it was the most challenging, just because, as I said, my first instinct was to ignore it and not to embarrass my children and my family and not make a big deal out of it. But as I said, I just felt it would have been letting a lot of other people down. Yeah, I suppose it was pretty, but it didn't make me cry. I mean, the mannequin incident actually made me cry because I just made me feel so sick. And my daughter, who's here tonight, I remember she said she felt sick, and they were all at school and they were so angry, and that was a lot worse.
There was 8 years between those two incidents.
Yeah, so I think we have come some way, not all the way though.
Yeah. Speaking about your daughter, what does being a mother do to your feminism, do you think?
Oh, well, it makes me realise that women are bloody good multitaskers, better than men. I think that feminism is not something we talk about at home. It's not something that I pontificate about with my friends. I went to a school that very strongly believed in feminist qualities, that when I left, I was of the belief that I could do anything, as were most people who went there, and my daughters went to the same school, and I hope they feel the same way. But I think that everyone, and there are two men in the family too, and I think they're feminists as well. I think becoming a mother, I don't think it's made me more of a feminist. I think it's made me happier that I'm a woman, I suppose.
That's cool.
That would be the one thing I'd say.
You mentioned Corrie Perkin. Who are the other powerful women in your life, do you think, that have sort of influenced or inspired you?
Definitely my mother, who just laughed at every story I ever told when I came home from school or work, and thought that everything I did was so hugely interesting. And also was a fantastic help in terms of raising a family and working full time.
Yeah.
Look, the women I love I'm a voracious reader. You know, I adore Lillian Hellman. I love Carol Shields. I mean, I could list the women authors that I absolutely love. When I was, it was an ill-fated hope because I've got the worst singing voice in the world, but as a teenager, my biggest crush in the world was Joni Mitchell, and I still love her lyrics to this day, and she inspired me partly to be a writer, as did an English teacher I had at school for 2 years by the name of Dean Turner, another woman. So there are a few I could reel off. But in terms of journos, I've got to say that most of the people were largely men, because there were no women sports writers, and there were no women editors in those days.
When you think about policy in the AFL, the champions of change, the leadership positions, the AFL partnership with Our Watch, do you think that those kinds of policy movements have a relationship to the football media and to the journalists that are reporting on, or is it how do you see your role in relation to those larger policy stories?
Oh well, I write a lot about off-field stuff. I think I leave a lot of the on-field stuff, the more technical stuff, to people better versed in it than me. And so I think it's vitally important. And when Gillan McLachlan became a champion of change, I mean, there've been suggestions that there were others at the AFL who wanted to pass it down the line, maybe to a younger executive or club executives. And there are a couple of club executives who hold that role as well. But I think we've got to be the watchdogs. And as I've written tomorrow, I can't understand why, as a champion of change, he did such a brilliant job in fast-tracking the launch of the Women's League, why he didn't fast-track an executive to run it.
So obvious.
Well, just... And I've spoken to, the executive who is the front man for all the big announcements at the moment, the new wage deal, the apparel deal, etc. And he's a fantastic bloke and he's done a great job, but I don't see why they couldn't have carried a woman along with him, and certainly culturally to make some of the announcements, because what we're seeing are these gorgeous footballers, but at the moment we're only seeing them, they're the only women we're seeing. We're not seeing anyone in a position of authority. I think that's really disappointing. And I think things like Our Watch and players being role models and those sort of things, I think that's an enormous issue that we look at every day. Some players don't like being role models, but as governments put more and more millions of dollars into the game, and as the AFL partner up with them to get money for their stadiums, they have to adhere to the drug policies they insist upon. And if coaches are going to, and players are going to get involved in a one-punch promotion, for example, they have to understand that they can't go out and get blind and punch someone. It's pretty simple.
You've mentioned before that when incidents about gender come up in the media, and they have and they will again, that the visibility of the female board members is often not that strong. Why do you think that is? Why is it that those women who are in leadership positions aren't kind of out to speak about these kinds of issues?
I think that's one of the most disappointing aspects of the AFL at the moment. I know that I talked about Sam Mostyn becoming a commissioner, which it might sound like a micromanagement topic, but it was such a pivotal time. And there was a strong view by some women board members that they shouldn't have expanded the commission, that someone should have been prepared to stand down to put a woman in. And I remember the first Collingwood woman board member spoke to me about that on the record, and Eddie and his CEO at the time just shut her down and told her, board members aren't meant to speak. That's not their role. And when the women board members were upset at, there was a group of them over the Ricky Nixon affair, and they felt that the AFL was dragging its feet over standing down Nixon over the St Kilda business and the 18-year-old girl, 17-year-old girl. They went and saw Andrew Demetriou, a group of these board members, and he just tore strips off them. And Andrew had been married in the past to a strong feminist, his first wife, who sadly died. And I always thought he was a fairly open-minded person, but he tore strips off these women board members, and they were too frightened to speak publicly. One of them was Susan Alberti, another one was not president at the time, but the Richmond's Peggy O'Neill, and they wouldn't talk to us publicly about it because they were worried their clubs would be penalised. Now that happens across the game, but if you're going to put women in these positions, I think you should break some of the protocols and they should be allowed to speak. So, yeah.
I'm a passionate follower of the Jonglin Cats, so I rely on your column and Footy Classified to keep me up with the latest gossip as well as, more serious stuff. I'd like to hear you comment on some things that I perceive from the privacy of my living room when I'm watching Footy Classified, but I'd like to hear your opinion about it, because I see that a member of the panel, he looms into your space the way that he does not loom into others' space. He talks over the top of you in ways that others don't. I think some people
could you be talking about?
I wonder who it would be. I thought I'd better protect myself by not naming him. And this has really annoyed me for some time.
Look, I do honestly believe that, and I'm not sticking, you're obviously talking about Craig Hutchison. And look, there have been times I think he has behaved badly. I think he's got a lot better over the years. He sees conflict as being the key to the show, and I do think that we are an interesting show because we don't all have the same opinions, and as good as some football analysis shows are, I don't want to sit around and hear four people agree on some really important point, even if it's an important point. But I think that I do think people find it difficult, and relatives of mine who love me can't bear to see them all yelling at me. But I think at times I do go yell back at them, and I get told off by producers for talking over people too. But I don't think it bothers people as much when it's a woman. But look, when he steps over the line, I have a real crack at him, and he's who he is, and for some reason people keep watching the show, and there are times he'll deliver an opinion that I know he doesn't believe, and he'll just say that, look, it wouldn't matter whether, whatever you said then, I was going to disagree with you, and he just thinks it's funny. But I also know that he's been this might surprise you, a champion for me in terms of, he championed to get me to Channel 9 when the show began, and he's been very apologetic when he's done the wrong thing. And so I guess, yes, he's very annoying. And you're asking me this question in November when I'm feeling pretty happy with the world. Maybe if you asked me in July, it would have been a different answer. I think the worst that ever happened, the one time I thought was one day when Gary was still on the show, and he'll be back next year, but I was having a crack at him about his very poor selection of Melbourne's coach. And the other two were stunned mullets and didn't say anything. And he got very aggressive and very angry. And I went like that. And I remember he said, "Don't fold your arms and get defensive," as he was leaning over me. And that was the first time I thought, no, not on. But, I also knew that I'd hit a nerve, and, yep, anyway. That was a long answer, sorry.
Fine. Next question. Yes.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you so much for your reporting over the years. And I still remember when you were on ABC Footy and having a disagreement with one of the male commentators, and him being absolutely gobsmacked and then responding by saying, "I find it really difficult to argue with a woman." But I'm really excited by the AFL Women's Initiative, and I know there's much that's very positive about it, but I do have some friends who work behind the scenes, and they report a lot of anger and disgruntlement around the fact that now the men have all discovered women's footy and how exciting it could be. And so a lot of the positions, from coaching and a whole range of other positions, have been moved in on by men who are jumping over women who have spent years in those positions or in those roles on the basis of, well, it's women's footy, geez, you know, we're men, we can do it easily. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on what you see happening behind the scene in terms of women being leapfrogged by men who've gone, oh, this is a good gig, and women who have put in their years, you know, not being recognised as having the skills.
I think that I hear what you're saying, but I also have spoken to some of the women players. For example, the former Collingwood Premiership player, Craig Starcevich, who has been a champion of the women's game and lives up in Queensland, and the women wanted him to be their coach. They didn't want a woman coach. I mean, they would have seen it as lip service had Craig moved into men's footy and they lost their coach because he was a national Queensland coach, and they had a woman, not because they didn't like women, but he was their coach, and they would have been disappointed if it had gone the other way. Michelle Cowan has gone back to Fremantle and is somehow managing to work with Ross Lyon, and he's somehow learning how to work with a woman coach, and she's going to coach their women's team. So, look, I really think in terms of the coaching positions, my view is that they have been very fairly chosen, and I have a bugbear, obviously, about women executives. There are a lot of women working behind the scenes, both on the ground and in terms of marketing, brand, you know, football, broadcasting, CBA and everything. But what can I say? There are more men at AFL headquarters than women, and we've got a long way to go. But I think it's improving, and I think that you're right, it's largely a positive story, and there will be incidences like that, but far less than, I think, certainly not in the coaching. I don't think that's as much of an issue myself. I have to say I disagree.
Carrie, given the value of diversity in thinking, when do you think the first AFL men's club will select a female head coach as a strategic decision, and which club?
Oh, look, I think we'll have a woman CEO way before we have a woman head coach. But I don't think it's beyond the realms. I mean, at the moment, there are 2 assistant coaches across the 18 clubs, and each club has about, 10 assistant coaches now when you look at development and welfare. And there are now 2 who are women. It's a start. And, interestingly, there are only 2 who are Indigenous, which goes to show how far we have to go in that area, as well as creating pathways for male Indigenous footballers when they finish the game. My interest, as another aside, will be when women Indigenous players come into the game in bigger numbers, how they will fare in life after footy, because I suspect they will find the transition a lot easier in many cases. It might sound a bit sexist, but I think they will. I think it'll be many years before blokes will listen to a woman head coach, and I don't know that that is something we should push to achieve, but I do think if we can just get more and more women into the system as line coaches for a start, that will be a massive, massive leap forward. But CEO will come first. One man said to me a few years ago, in fact, when Essendon was choosing between, ominously, their new head of fitness, and there was a woman who'd been there and who'd filled in the role. One of the footy managers at the club at the time said to me, men just really find it hard to listen to a woman screeching at them. They probably should have gone for her. It would have saved them many, many millions of dollars and a few careers and reputations.
A question down the front, I think.
We're really trading at the Herald Sun with blokes like John Craven and that. How that sets you up for the future, because they're a pretty tough group of guys.
John Craven was the athletics writer when I was there, and they were a tough group of guys, but it was a really good... they were also very generous, and their advice was pretty brutal and pretty simple. get good stories, work hard, and get on the back page. Nothing else sort of counts. And as I said, you know, it was so different. There weren't media managers or mobile phones, so you had to get people between the time they either at home before 7:30 a.m. or by the time they got to work at 9, and we had early deadlines, and if you missed them, you know, you missed that window, you were stuffed. So watching them work was just an amazing... I remember, you know, Mike Sheehan was chief football writer, and he's become a great friend, but I remember sitting there over 1 week. He broke 2 coach sackings, Royce Hart from Footscray and Tom Hafey from Collingwood, and their story about the $1 million offers to, I think it was Peter Moore and Kelvin Templeton at the Melbourne Football Club. This is early 80s, a lot of you won't remember this. It was just an unbelievable time and a great learning experience. And, you know, I don't think it's a bad thing sometimes to tell people to lift their game and to pull their socks up and to work a bit harder and why don't you go and do this and do that. I mean, I don't think that's a bad thing in the workplace. I think sometimes we can be too easy on people and sometimes you do need to be told off. So I thought it was good. I thought they certainly weren't too tough. They were very funny too. There was always a lot of laughs.
Well,
and generous with their knowledge as well, you know, contacts and stuff like that.
I'm just curious about your thoughts on kind of the blokey culture that allows, where they defend each other's bad behaviour and the reinvention of Wayne Carey in particular.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and it's one close to my heart because I worked for a year with Wayne on Footy Classified, and then that Australia Day weekend incident happened, and I remember ringing the boss of the network and saying I didn't want to work with him, and it wasn't an issue because I think they'd already taken the decision to let him go. Look, I think Wayne Carey, what he did obviously was incredibly unimpressive. I think he was a human being I think he did have a damaged childhood, a very difficult childhood. I don't know if you've read his book, but it's one of the better unmitigated apologies and explanations I've ever read, not delivering any excuses anymore, but unashamedly and without reservation apologising for what he'd done. And what can I say? It's a very forgiving industry. I know there are still people who wouldn't cross the road to talk to Wayne Carey, but Channel 7 love him and love his commentary. The Age loves his columns, and they asked all of us whether we would be prepared to let him come back and write for us. And after meeting with him, I said that was fine. I mean, I think people in football have done a lot worse things than Wayne Carey, put it that way. And what he did was terrible. He was charged, he was under the influence of drugs, and as I said, he completely and unreservedly said what he did was wrong. So it might sound a bit wishy-washy, but I wasn't the one who brought him back into the game, but I wasn't prepared to stand in his way and ban him either. I didn't see that as my role.
You've actually, interestingly enough, spoken a lot about the apology, you know, like the notion of apologising or saying sorry. What makes a good one as opposed to a bad one? Because I think you've experienced both.
Well, look, I think we are such a forgiving society, and football mirrors society, and I think it's a very forgiving game.
Which is a good thing, you think?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think forgiveness is really important. But I think that what people can't stand in life, as in football, is when it's the, if I offended anyone, I'm sorry. Or I'm really sorry, but there was A, B, C, D, E and F. And as a journalist who occasionally makes mistakes, it's really important to put your hand up when you have, even though it's really terrible and difficult, and say, I got that wrong. And not then say, but you know, it was right for a minute, but then it became wrong, and someone gave me the wrong information, or I was under pressure. You stuffed up, you got it wrong, and you're sorry. And I think all Australians are absolutely fine about that. And, you know, the sorry word has become, it's become so political, but it should be so simple. Just say you're sorry. And I do believe, and I'm not here as an apologist for Wayne Carey, but I do believe he did finally do that. And it's interesting that others, you know, find the S word so difficult.
Well, yeah, it's fascinating that sports people have had to work towards becoming good at it, and politicians are just horrendous and can be horrendous about it.
Yeah, but some apologies now that clubs have, employed 3 or 4 media people and have these websites and advisors and political consultants. And when Mick Malthouse called Stephen Milne an effing rapist, that apology had to be, I think they negotiated over a 24-hour period. And,
right.
I think he ended up invoking the spirit of Winston Churchill. It was just unbelievable.
Next question.
There's one over there.
Just a general question, Caroline. What do you think of quotas for women, like a legal profession, political party?
I think quotas are really important, and that is another thing that I should have mentioned that I have changed my opinion about, because we wouldn't have got a woman onto the commission without quotas, even though it was a hidden, unseen quota. And I think club boards have unofficially been told that they need to, if you haven't got at least 2 women on your board, you're in trouble. And most of them do now. Some of them have more. And again, with the example I gave of the Melbourne Cricket Club, women were rushed through. They didn't have to go on waiting lists and wait 15 years because they were never given the chance as kids. So, I got in straight away because a very nice and generous male gave up his guest pass, so I could immediately become a member. And that's a form of quoterism. And I think that in the end, there's too many times when men and others just say, look, we'd love to have a woman in this job, but there just isn't one suitable or available, and it's too often their convenient excuse. So I'm a big believer in quotas across all industries.
Next question.
Thanks, Caroline. Is that on? You mentioned before that you think that female writers write differently to male sports writers, and I was just curious as to how you think they write differently, how they approach it differently.
Oh, look, I think that I think the great thing about AFL football is that everybody has an opinion on it, or people who love it do, and 20 people can go to a game and 20 people can walk away with a different best player, a different opinion, a different thought about the game. And for me, I can really only speak to myself because I know the way I see it. And I think my great advantage early on was that I found it easier to ask questions that might have sounded a bit dumb or lacked the technical knowledge or the lingo that was used in AFL football. And from a very young age, I think maybe footballers spoke differently to a woman and maybe opened up more, and maybe I sought more of the personal or more emotional stuff being a woman. I think that's changed now. I think more women writing in the game has changed. If I have to not really answer your question but describe it, I think more men now go down that personal path as well, because I just think it's more interesting. And I think when the Wayne Carey incident happened at his footy club, all bets were off in terms of the way the game was reported. I mean, for the first time, really personal stuff was aired because it affected a footy club. Emma Quill, who I work with, has made young players and people coming through in the draft her special area, and she's become the best at it. And she writes in such a lovely conversational way and not sensationalist at all, and yet her articles are must read. So I think we see the game differently, so we write about it differently. But if I had to talk about it in terms of style, I think every writer has a different style, not just men and women.
Oh, Caroline, you were telling us how Mum was interested in your stories. What role did Dad play in you becoming such a fantastic AFL commentator?
Well, apart from banning me from the rooms. Oh no, look, I think both my parents are really proud of me. Dad too was, very supportive because he had contacts in the media industry. I think it was one of the reasons I got down to it's always been very competitive to get into newspapers. I think I got down to the last 40 of my intake because of that, because of his contacts. So he helped get me a job, and I'm not ashamed of that because I think I've justified it. But it's funny, Dad doesn't really, that's not meant to sound boastful, but I'm still in the industry 35 years later. So Dad Dad now just wants to talk about footy with me and talk about issues and opinions, and he'll ring up and... Sorry? Oh, yep, definitely. Definitely a bit of debate, and definitely not happy about some of the early big stories I broke if they involve Richmond. And but I think very proud of me as well.
Probably have time for just a couple more questions.
He wasn't happy about the Triple M business, and I remember he drove down from where he lives on the Mornington Peninsula. He drove an hour and a half just to catch up, and we were having a cup of coffee at my kitchen table, and he said, "It was just the Black Widow. I didn't like it when they called you the Black Widow. That was the only thing that bothered him, not the drowning or the..." Anyway, yes.
I was really surprised and delighted by the telecast of the women's game out from the Western Oval. I thought the commentators and the people on the panel did a great job covering that. They'd obviously done their homework, yes, and they weren't patronising and all that stuff. But there is yet to be a game caller who is a woman. There are commentators, but
there actually has Kelly Underwood.
So, apart from Kelly Underwood,
yep.
Yeah. Do you know if there's any pathways to that sort of career for women in footy, given the start of the Women's League? I think it's important that there should be some.
Well, I think that culturally there will be so many changes, and I think women having their own league, these women are going to come through as officials, as media commentators, maybe footy callers, coaches. All aspects of the industry will be bolstered by women, because these women are going to be such a fantastic asset to our game. I think that, again, like the footy manager who told me men didn't like women screeching at them, Channel 10, they just wimped it with Kelly. I mean, they put her in as an experiment, and after 2 years they dropped her. And she wasn't their best commentator, but she certainly wasn't their worst. And she was a new commentator, and they persisted with other young commentators, but not her, because of the negative publicity they were getting from, I reckon, unfair negative emails, etc., and social media. But he's still calling footy on the ABC. I think he's become a really good caller. I mean, he's not as good as Gerard Whateley, but he's a very, very good football caller. And I just hope he persists, because I think when she got a job calling footy on Channel 10, that was a far bigger barrier to overcome and I was just so disappointed when they pulled back after 2 years. But I do think that is one area, you're right, you've nailed it, is one area where, and I think with women footballers, if we watch people like Daisy Pearce and Katie Brennan and Taylor Harris and Mo Hope, and then some of those might want to become commentators, I think maybe they will be given a bit more respect, and I think that'll be a great thing.
Hi. Just before you're mentioning about football being quite forgiving, just wondering if it happens, when do you think, do you believe that basically James Hird will go into the media? And if so, when?
Well,
or how many years?
At the moment you'd have to say no, but I'd never thought Wayne Carey would come back either. The difference is I don't think Wayne Carey was ever deified or sanctified or seen as such a massive hero role model. I don't think Wayne Carey's fall was as great as James Hird's fall. Look, I think he's back in Melbourne now. It's been hard for him. I'm sure that he's had some pretty big emotional issues to overcome, because that fall from grace and what he went through must have been a terrible experience, and a real lesson in how much better it would have been for him had he put his hand up at the beginning. I mean, I think he could have saved his career personally, but because I don't think anyone thinks, he knew the extent of what was being given to those players, but he just should never have allowed it. Anyway, I think it's pretty tough to see him coming back to the media, though. I don't think it'll be for some years to come. I think he'll stay away from footy for a while. He's not going to his club premiership reunions. There are still people there he doesn't want to face. His own teammates have talked about performing some form of intervention to try and get him to come back into the fold, and that could be the start of a bit more. But it would take a major shift in the way people are thinking now and the way the game feels about him for that to happen, for him to be seen as a credible commentator, in my view.
We probably have time for one more question.
Caroline, they say the best sports over here. Sorry, at the back. To the.
Hello.
Hi. They say the best sports journalists can't be fans, and I was just wondering your thoughts on how you disassociate being an avid fan of the game since you were very young to breaking these stories that really shake up the sport.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They can't be. I mean, it does help to have an innate love of the game, because I think you understand things that you love more than you do something you're not that interested in, even though a good journalist should be able to write about anything. I feel very strongly about football writers who are fans, and just as I feel strongly about football writers who protect their contacts and their friends, because in the end, you have to barrack for the story. And I think that I'm much more passionate about newspapers and radio and media as a whole, and about my job, than, even though I felt like crying, when the Western Bulldogs won the premiership, and I did cry when the Swans finally won one after 72 years. And even though those things can move you incredibly emotionally, you often find that you don't write as well when you're emotionally overcome by something. So you have to try and stay a bit dispassionate, and you have to try and keep yourself, even though it is a very familial industry and it's a community-based industry and gets on very well and there are some great people, you have to stay on the outside to a degree. You really have to be on the outer sanctum, I think, to be dispassionate about what you write. And I'm writing at the moment on an almost daily basis about Graham Allen, who I've had a good friendship with and over many years, but I'm writing some things about him at the moment that maybe means we'll never be friends again, but that's the job, and I think he's done the wrong thing, and it's a story, so it has to be dealt with.
And I think that devotion to the story is why we all respect and admire your work so much.
Thank you, Emma.
Caro, please join me in thanking Caroline.
Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.